morning. Good morning. I join John Anning and Liz Davis in welcoming you to this special UUFRC outdoor service at Huddard Park. It's a delight and a privilege to be here to celebrate our coming together in person for worship for the first time in many months. And just to hear us all reciting the chalice lighting words together was very meaningful to me. I would like to start with a few acknowledgments. First, gratitude to each of you for making the journey up here today. Not easy with all those bicycles claiming the hill. It's wonderful to see so many of you here. I also want to acknowledge those of you who couldn't be here today, either because of distance or safety reasons, and we really miss their and your presence among us. Thank you to Grant Huberty for recording the service for people to view later. Here we sit. Yeah, thank you, Grant. Here we sit in a peaceful forest among trees older than human lifespans. I acknowledge this beautiful plant life around us. Next, I will read the acknowledgement by San Mateo County Parks to the native peoples who have inhabited this land. Our shelter is called the Miwok Shelter, but it's actually the Ohlone peoples who resided here. We acknowledge that this park is located in the ancestral homeland of the Ohlone peoples, and that as the original stewards of this land, the Ohlone understood the interconnectedness of all things and maintained harmony with nature for millennia. Indigenous communities have lived in and moved through this place over hundreds of generations, and indigenous peoples from many nations live and work in this region today. Please join me in honoring their ancestors, their elders, and their communities. Thank you. Today's service is an In Our Own Words celebration of spiritual autobiography writers. Thanks to Reverend Brian, we now have spiritual reflections by UUFRC community members at most of our services. Today's readers all participate in spiritual autobiography writing groups that meet monthly to share their written reflections. Please talk with me after the service if you're interested in joining one of these groups. I thank all the spiritual writers in today's service and past and future services. I also want to thank all the dedicated and talented musicians participating in our service today. The topic for today's service is adventure. When I hear this word, I often picture someone rappelling off a cliff or skydiving, entering a dangerous or exciting situation. But adventure doesn't always entail taking physical risks. Adventure does involve proceeding into the unknown, exploring and expanding one's horizons, embracing uncertainty. Today's speakers will share disparate experiences of change and challenge and reflect on how their perspectives and lives have altered as a result. I hope these reflections will inspire you to consider the adventures in your own life and how they invite each of us to grow into new awareness and understanding.
Good morning. I'm Janette Rabin, and I'm so happy to be here and so happy to see people in person. It's so exciting. Travel has always been my passion. I owned a travel agency and worked in the industry for over 25 years. I've been lucky to visit many countries and with my partner Ron to visit all 7 continents. The more I travel, the more I learn that all over the world people share the same concerns and dreams of a happy and healthy life for themselves and their family. Seeing the same images depicted in scenes and cultures, from cultures separated by thousands of miles in so many ancient graphics, sculptures, and artworks, convinces me that we are all connected. One of my most memorable and life-changing adventures was to a continent with very few people. Ron and I boarded a ship at Ushuaia, the southernmost city in the world, and cruised to Antarctica. Our first impression on sighting Antarctic land was a very large expanses of pristine, untouched snow with no greenery, no footprints, and no signs of life. We sailed into the desolate bay where Shackleton's crew was stranded for over a year while he went to get help for them. How desperate and lonely they must have been. Each day we boarded small zodiacs for a new adventure. We got off on a smelly island of ice with hundreds of penguins. The penguins and huge sea lions paid absolutely no attention to the big red critters, us in our red parkas. We were not a threat. The penguins would literally walk across our feet. We were one with nature. Aside from our other ship passengers and crew, the only people we saw for 10 days was when we stopped at a Polish scientific research station. It was very desolate, but the few scientists that were there were very welcoming, and I think happy to see some new faces. We visited an abandoned British site where researchers had spent long periods of time studying uncontaminated nature. Coffee cups were on the shelves, some canned goods remained. It has been uninhabited for years, but they left their mark on the land. Large albatross and other bird species flew around the ship. Floating pieces of ice went by with giant sea lions lounging on them. Groups of penguins drove in and out of the water, and the passengers rushed to the side of the ship to watch large pods of whales cavort and play. There was both a marine biologist and an ornithologist on board to give us a better understanding of the many species of wildlife in the area. There were very few humans, but it was hardly deserted. On one especially memorable day, the sky was clear and blue, the air crisp and cold, and we boarded the Zodiacs to float among magnificent giant icebergs. Their beautiful colors of gray, blue, pink, white, and lavender glistening in the sun. The icebergs were massive, some 20 stories above the water and 3 times as deep under the water. The shapes were sculpted and curved with some arches big enough to drive through in a large boat. Each iceberg was totally unique and awesome. I truly felt very small and inconsequential and overwhelmed by their majesty. Our Zodiac captain guided our group into a quiet little cove away from the master ship and the other Zodiacs. He stopped the motor and we all sat perfectly still. It was the most intense quiet I have ever experienced. Just an occasional crack of the icebergs shifting, and once in a while a gentle tap of water against the side of the boat. We sat for about a half an hour, each person engrossed in the magic of the moment, lost in our own thoughts, not saying a word. It was awe-inspiring and humbling to realize what a small part we humans are in the vast universe. It was a moment of grace and connection to the earth and all of its inhabitants and to the entire universe. I felt totally at peace within the beauty of creation and blessed by a divine source. Truly a magical and memorable moment.
When Beth framed the topic for today, adventure, I scratched my head and I said, do I have anything about that? Adventure is one of those words that make me break out in hives. I have an MBA after all, which means that I'm fundamentally risk averse. But then I found this piece. The title is something my dad used to say to me every time I'd visit him. If you're so smart, brother, why ain't you rich? It was a Saturday morning in the early 1990s, and I'm rushing from one of UCLA's giant parking structures to Haynes Hall. I have a date with a proctor, not, fortunately, a proctologist. The weather is bright, smog in abeyance, a beautiful spring morning in October. I'm 45 years old and about to take the graduate record exam again. By the time I arrive, a crowd has already gathered in front of Haynes, most of them in their early 20s. Some of them are chatting. I guess they know one another, but mostly we stand around like cattle, waiting for the truck to the slaughterhouse. For the next 4 hours, we will be attempting to prove to some admissions officer somewhere that we belong in their august institution. But first, we must answer questions which test our verbal and quantitative reasoning. It wasn't this hard the first time I took the test. Of course, I was only 20, confident that my testing skills would win me a place in some graduate program. And then 10 years later, I took the GMAT. That was also a piece of cake. But right now I'm having difficulty. And as if I needed it, this is further proof that I'm starting to slip. Even so, I'm considering a third trip to graduate school. It seems that whenever I come to an impasse in my life, I go back to school. It's not as unreasonable as you might think. School has been the only thing I've been reasonably good at. Besides, for a while, I can forget about my long, undistinguished record of failure in the world of work and life in general. So this time I'm thinking about a creative writing program. I've been studying for 5 years with a private writing teacher, but I want something more professional, something that will propel me to a higher level of accomplishment and maybe even some income. I'm calculating 100 times my current poetry income of 0 is still 0, okay? I'm sure that this time I'm doing the right thing. I'm studying the right thing finally, you know? But I'm 45, a failure at work, a 2-time loser at marriage. How can I be so sure? When I was younger, my dad, a strict utilitarian, would always ask, "If you're so smart, brother, why ain't you rich?" I didn't get home very often during those early years, but he would always find time to ask that question. I tried, I really did, to tell him about the struggles that I had with my jobs and everything else. But he was right, of course. I wasn't rich, nor was I ever likely to be anything but poor, except for the occasional inconvenience of not knowing whether I could meet the next month's rent or pay my other bills. I didn't much care. I was a true child of the 60s. I didn't care about mortgages or progeny. I had set my sight on higher things. I'm sure you want to know what those higher things were. So would I. They probably had something to do with poetry. I left the GRE feeling like someone who'd just undergone a full body transplant. I wasn't sure who I was. The place looked familiar. The faint petrochemical tang was what autumn smelled like in LA. But I didn't recognize my body. I wiggled my fingers, clenched my toes, took a couple of deep breaths. For the past four hours, everything that was happening in my body was happening in my head. Some people take drugs to achieve an altered state of consciousness. I take tests. 6 months later, I learned that I'd been accepted to 2 writing programs I'd applied to, both of them over the hill and far away. What to do? I'd have to borrow living expenses, but that was okay. I'd been living like a monk ever since my first trip to graduate school. And then I stopped and considered. Maybe it was time in the middle of my 5th decade to do something different. There's that joke you hear in 12-step programs about seeing a hole, the one you've been falling into your whole life, and stepping into it anyway. I was one of those guys. But I was also the guy in Dante's Inferno. You remember how that begins. Midway on life's journey, I found myself in dark woods, the right road lost. To tell about these woods is hard, so tangled and rough. The right road? Who knew what that looked like? Not me. All I knew was that the woods were indeed very dark. And yet it was a moment of profound freedom, an opportunity to look at the hamster, haggard and starved, speeding on his treadmill, and take him out of the cage for a little lettuce and kibble, a little R&R. In a moment, I realized that my whole adult life had been one long attempt to prove myself to my father, to prove that I could be some kind of success. Maybe not in his terms, but a success nonetheless. Suddenly, I found things to keep me in LA. Friends, a job, a girlfriend, and then I found a poetry teacher. But I wasn't committing to anything just then. Everything was provisional. I was a person groping in the dark woods. testing every step for the lay of the land, hands out, feeling my way. Were there thorns or boulders, bark, grass, flowers? Every step was a test. Suzuki Roshi, Buddhist apostle to the West, wrote a book titled Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind, which I read about this time. My new poetry teacher was also a Buddhist and eventually taught me the Zen style of meditation, which is sitting on a cushion until your knees start screaming, okay? Suzuki Roshi's point was that every moment is its own adventure. Zen mind, beginner's mind. Adventure is a Western word, probably not up to the subtlety of Buddhist thought, but then neither am I. So I'll use that word. Suddenly my life began to feel like an adventure. Everything felt new. I felt new. I was feeling, maybe for the first time in my life, deeply, feeling my way through life. Gradually, my need to prove something to my critical internal father dissipated, and I started to enjoy the pleasures, small and large, that came my way. I went river rafting and nearly drowned. I joined a cult. I wrote and wrote and wrote, and eventually read what I wrote to audiences, small audiences of unwitting innocents. No one had ever asked to know the real me, not my parents, not my teachers, nuns and priests, not my employers. But suddenly, I was sharing that quivering, viscous jelly, think of a hamster, with whoever crossed my path in that dark wood. And it's been that way ever since. Thank you.
So my piece is a great, perfect transition from the song. There are small adventures that are for a day, some for a season or chapter of your story. Then there's a grand adventure of building, or sometimes discovering in retrospect, the animating purpose for the arc of your life. What matters? What is worth your commitment, sacrifice, service? What defines you? What provides a sense of direction that feels true and transcendent? To paraphrase Mary Oliver, where did you end up on the question of making something out of your one wild and precious life? My answers are informed by my understanding of my place in my family and history. My grandmother, Teresa, was born in Mexico to illiterate campesinos from Spain. She was pulled out of school at age 12 because educating girls was a waste. She had to work to help the family of 7 kids. She and her sisters cooked and ironed for all the men of the family and kept their head down to avoid being beaten. Once married, Teresa hustled to supplement her husband's irregular jobs. One project involved loading up her 3 kids onto a bus from Mexico City across the border to the United States to buy clothing and then reselling it out of her living room. Eventually, Teresa and her husband started recycling plastic with a makeshift machine they built themselves in their patio. All the family members sorted scraps and fed them into the machine, and it cost my grandfather the tips of 3 of his fingers. My grandmother's adventure was survival. My mother, Macarena, got perfect grades under threats that she shouldn't shame the family by showing she didn't deserve the scholarship she got thanks to her aunt working in a religious private school. She was the first in her class every single grade from elementary school through high school. Her teachers told her to stand in front of the boys' line to humiliate them, which did not earn her many friends. My mother never went to a restaurant when she was growing up, never had more than 1 dress per year, never traveled outside Mexico City. She went to a free public university to study medicine, one of a handful of women in the graduating class, and then paid her debt as required by doing a year of social service in a high-needs rural area. Then she kept moving, learning English in 48-hour shifts on the job, working in Saskatchewan, Canada, where it was below 0 much of the year, and where she had no support system. Still, she persisted, and years later, she was one of the pioneers in the nascent field of ultrasound. My mother's adventure was achievement. I think of the choices available to the woman who came before me and realize what a privilege it is that the adventure of my life has been working for social change. The only reason I had that choice is because they worked so hard that my energy would be freed up to ask, what feels meaningful, transcendent, and strategic? How can I give back? I've been rich in opportunity. Growing up mostly as a native to the US, though my summers were spent in Mexico living with my grandparents and cousins. Speaking English fluently, though Spanish is my first language and the connection to my close-knit extended family. And I don't look Mexican, so have avoided a lot of the discrimination faced by others with immigrant parents. I ponder what my kids' overarching adventure will be. I'm tempted to nudge them in the direction of my dreams, but I know I will have to let them go and discover their own animating purpose, the challenges they want to take on, the path that will be forged by their curiosity, character, comfort level, and courage. All I can offer is these stories, the sense of history, so they know the roots that nourish them and the sap that still runs through them as they grow into their own unique branch. My grandmother never dreamed her daughter would be a doctor in the United States. My mom didn't think it was possible that her daughter would help change unjust laws and institutions. I hope my kids' adventures are something I can't even imagine.
This is a very personal reflection, and originally it was titled Upending Your Lifestyle, so you could think about the implications for you. This is my adventure, moving to a new home in a retirement community, moving without Elaine, my wife of 20 years. I went through some health changes in early 2020 that encouraged me to think about the long-term future and what would provide security in old age. I recalled my parents relocating to a continuing care retirement center and finding it suited their needs and lifestyle very well. Elaine and I started looking at options in the Bay Area. One that stood out was the Peninsula Regent in San Mateo. It was close by. It was relatively new. It was designed specifically for senior living. We were guests at any number of events at the Regent designed to introduce us to the community and to the culture. I was enthusiastic. Elaine was enthusiastic for me. But she was not ready to move. Then the pandemic hit. A move seemed risky. We declined. Fast forward a year. The pandemic was under control. The Regent invited us back. There were many condominiums available at attractive prices. One with a good view, a great exposure, and an upper floor location seemed too good to pass up. Elaine agreed, for me. I alone purchased. Now I am an owner and a solo resident. Have you ever set out on a hike or a road trip or a sailing trip that you have not done before and know that uncertainties await you? And you alone will face these uncertainties? You have no companion to help you. This is what I am doing with my move to a senior community. It is a move to a new place that I have never experienced before. I do not have a companion on this journey. What are the uncertainties? Will I be comfortable living alone after nearly 50 years of having a mate? Will I find the community engaging and vital and fun to be with? Will I be accepted as a full-fledged member at the outset? Or will I have to go through a process or ritual, a hazing ritual, to earn acceptance? Or will it simply take time? And how long? These are questions that make me wonder whether a move of this magnitude is worth it at this point in life. It is helpful to ask, what am I trying to achieve? Connection to community and a larger circle of friends is certainly out there. There are more than 200 souls from all walks of life, of all ages, over 65, interests and talents. I look forward to a richer experience in a village with a community at my fingertips. The adventure is to make new discoveries about life, about me, about people I will come to know. The adventure is about staying on track and not losing my way.